You're welcome to the Bridgewater Perspective. My name is Matthias Tume, analyst in the research and intelligence team of Bridgewater Advisors. Today, I have here with me Prosper Melome, a partner at Bridgewater Advisors Limited. Prosper, you're welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Matthias.
Today, we are looking at the credit ratings and implications that these have on businesses and the business community. We see reports from Fitch downgrading economies like Ghana and then other economies. We realize that about 60% of low-income economies have so far received a downgrade and been made to be seen as assessed as a high-risk debt distress economies. We are looking at this situation and how these mean to the business community at large. What does this credit ratings mean? The Fitch report released on Ghana indicated about 8 key drivers, which were the basis for their assessments. They looked at the fact that there's a likelihood of debt restructuring in the situation of Ghana, the high debt service, the pressure that is so far on the reserves of the country, the impending IMF program, which is still in the process and not yet finally settled, coupled with issues of fiscal consolidations. Looking at all of these things, they came up with further downgrades and hints of further downgrades if issues are not resolved. So we want to look at this situation. What does this mean? What does this downgrade mean? And what led to Ghana's downgrade situation?
Okay. So regarding downgrades, it's important we understand what it actually means. What we are talking about in this Fitch situation, I believe S&P also downgraded, same as Moody's.
Yes.
So these are the big three rating agencies. And when it comes to this downgrade, we are particularly talking about sovereign risk. Okay. And so sovereign risk ratings basically are a measuring mechanism of the creditworthiness of an economy. So what this means is basically an assessment and thereby putting a rate or a ranking to what is regarded as risk associated with Ghana's debt instruments. And to put this in more specific context, we are looking at assessing the ability, willingness, and capacity of the country to repay its debt or more or less meet its debt obligations. So this is what the sovereign risk ratings stand for. It is often or in some areas confused with what we call the country risk. Okay. So country risk and sovereign risk are not the same. Okay. So country risk generally measures the risk of investing in an economy or doing business in an economy. So the country risk will look primarily at or measure things or put a number of things into consideration, such as ease of doing business, global competitiveness, and a number of other factors, including political risk and all of these things. So it is important that we separate the two, although there may be some cross relationships. But sovereign risk in this particular instance, and thereby the downgrading of Ghana's ratings, is basically to mean that the market, in this case, perceives Ghana or looks at Ghana's ability to satisfy its obligations as very low. You understand? So this has a number of implications as well. Regarding implications of this, we are looking at the ability, two major areas, the ability of the country to borrow and the cost of borrowing. So these are the two areas that downward ratings or whatever rating will in generally impact your ability to borrow and the cost at which you borrow. particularly on the sovereign level, which means the national level. So this is what it means.
And I think you mentioned the three rating agencies. I mean, you mentioned the Fitch, S&P, and Moody's. The rating agencies is really dominated by these three. 90% of the market share is dominated by these three. There is this position where are the rating agencies quick to just downgrade developing economies? There's that position. Do you think?
Well, recently at the UN Assembly, General Assembly, the Excellency of the Republic of Ghana, the President, made certain remarks regarding how quick rating agencies are in downgrading developing or African economies. So the question about quickness is indeed one that is open to a wide scale of debate. There are arguments about the methodologies, and the transparency, and the way some of these agencies are approaching downgrading or generally rating some of these countries, developing countries in particular. The idea is there are certain unique characteristics that are associated with certain markets, and therefore there should be some type of methodologies that properly contextualizes those markets. And so, yes, there's the position that the rating agencies are not entirely neutral, particularly if you look at the fact that the key ratings that are done influences borrowing on foreign debt markets. So you are looking at the Eurobond market, for example, right? So the reason why they rate is to give opportunity for countries like Ghana to borrow on foreign debt markets. So then someone may wonder, I mean, so are they being truly independent as being foreign rating agencies, or they are, acting in some form of bias? Because at the end of the day, you may say, well, if the rating is bad, it's indicative of risk, and therefore it will protect investors. But the other side of it is, okay, what if you are not entirely objective with your rating? It means that you have a country with a low rating, which implies that the cost of borrowing will be very high, and that cost of borrowing rather returns to an investor. So it could be a mechanism whereby there could be some form of manipulation to influence returns. However, these are all just arguments. The arguments that parties are making. I mean, we have the African side of it, where there are parties arguing that, it's about time Africa has its own rating agencies and the like, but for me, it's neither here nor there. I think at the end of the day, whatever reasons are given are reasons that we can all analyze and see the extent to which they hold. Okay.
All right. So we come back to the situation of Ghana, and this is actually this. We are looking at the 8 key drivers that Fitch ratings gave as the reason for the downgrade. And I want to know your thoughts on it. They talked about the likelihood of a debt restructuring, the high debt service situation, the pressure that is on the country's reserve, the pending IMF program, and then the possibility that an exclusion of partially guaranteed notes from debt restructuring, and then the ESG governance score 5 plus of Ghana. These are some of the key drivers that they looked at. What are your opinions on these key drivers?
Well, regarding the drivers, I think almost all of them are straightforward and obvious. We are aware of the high debt service. In the history of our economic management, the economy used to have the wage bill being the largest expense line until debt service took over. So we have that high debt service situation, which we've been trying to look at for about 3 years now. And then, and so that's pretty straightforward. Regarding debt restructuring, well, these are pretty much rumors as we speak.
Yeah.
But they are not, I mean, like, as I said, there's no smoke without fire. So why is this coming up? The basic reason for this is the country is in talks with the IMF.
Yes.
And the IMF will not accept to usher in a program if the economy's debt is not sustainable. So, as we heard from the finance minister about a week or so ago, where he was making statements about the IMF carrying out a debt sustainability analysis. Yes. And so the DSA has to be done. And until we are regarded as, having a sustainable debt level, the program will not kick in. And one of the ways to make debt sustainable, or more or less, what does debt sustainability mean? Basically, it should be such that you have debt at a level where you are able to fulfill your obligations. All right? Yeah. And one of the ways to do that is to reduce your debt burden, or the sequence of, or the mechanism, or the schedule of repayment to meet your revenue or cash generating ability. So in that light, it's looking more or less, let me say, obvious that in this particular situation, where most of our debt portfolio are commercial in nature, so government has to meet these obligations. Yeah. Which other way will government meet the obligations than to perhaps consider a restructure if in order to accommodate the obligations, or as some are even saying, possibilities of haircuts. So that is something that is a likelihood, and indeed Fitch did mention it's a likelihood in their press release.
Yes.
And so that is also something that we are aware of. We are looking at limited access to the Eurobond markets, which is true. The ratings obviously, once again, makes it practically impossible for the country to borrow from the markets.
Shut down from the Eurobond market, totally.
Exactly. I think even Fitch was talking about not doing any more country analysis or so in terms of ratings and the like on the country, because it is in a position where it will not be able to give us certain ratings that would give some opinion, or let me say independent opinion, as far as risk is concerned, because where it is a bit too dire for the rating agencies to get involved. So yes, indeed, Ghana has very limited access to the markets unless the ship turns around. And then we are looking at
so then talked about the fiscal consolidation issue, the IMF pending program. The IMF program is still pending, and we are looking at the IMF, bailing out the economy. But before we continue, there's one important question that I think that everybody will be interested in. Will Ghana survive a debt default?
Wow, that's an interesting question. Will Ghana survive a debt default? Well, on the domestic market, this is pretty much in line with the considerations for a debt restructure. The financial system in Ghana is highly skewed towards lending to the government and not the private sector. And the primary lenders, particularly when it comes to financial intermediation, are the banks. So the banks have a portfolio highly skewed towards the government, the public sector. So, and we also need to think about how the banks mobilize these funds. They mobilize these funds from households, individuals, and businesses. Yeah. So when we talk about defaults, haircuts, and the like, we are really trying to put the economy in a very difficult position where, once again, we came from a financial sector cleanup, where public perception of the financial sector was hit. And so if there are defaults, once again, most of these individuals that have monies with the banks, they would not necessarily sit at the table having a conversation with the finance minister about defaults. They'll be talking to their bankers.
Yes.
So once again, I mean, it's going to be a situation where public perception of the financial institutions will go down. When that happens, savings levels will drop significantly. And so you generally see that kind of ripple effect, and it comes back to hit everything again. So the default scenario, these are the possible issues, but we are hoping that doesn't come up.
Okay, so then it's a lot of hits coming on the financial service sector once we are into a possible restructuring situation. The business community looked at this downgrade. Has the sovereign downgrade situation, what does this mean to the business community as a whole?
Okay, so when it comes to the business community, we need to look at this carefully. We are looking at downgrade at the sovereign level. So we are looking at sovereign credit risk. But earlier on I mentioned this is different from country risk.
Yes.
But they are sometimes, the sovereign risk could be a proxy for country risk in certain circumstances. So it will impact. There are a number of areas of impact, but I'm going to center it around certain key drivers or areas as it pertains to the financial economy. First and foremost, I'll comment about the foreign direct investment attractiveness of the country. Definitely, this is going to affect that. And when that happens, FDIs influence business relationships. So, for example, you have some foreign investment in the country. It's one of the ways of stimulating economic activity within the business community. So any foreign business or whatsoever that has some form of footprint in the market is going to economically interact with local businesses and therefore push growth. So if we lose out on FDI, it's going to hit the business community. Then the second point is corporate credit. So we are looking at corporate credit. Now, we need to bear in mind that the sovereign risk or risk associated with sovereign debt instruments become, in many instances, a proxy to set a base for local corporate credit lines.
Okay.
So when you have corporate credits trying to borrow, there's this that is considered, particularly corporate entities that want to borrow or do any form of debt transactions that involve the international markets. So if the government is at level A, then we are going to consider you to be level A plus something.
Yes.
So obviously
because you exist in that economic environment.
Yes, exactly. So that's for corporate credit. Then 3, generally the rise in interest rates. Okay, so now you need to understand that the government, even when it comes to domestic borrowing, when there's this downgrade, it influences perception. And so even on the domestic front, the expectation for government instruments is going to be higher returns because risk is perceived to be very high. Okay. Now, government's domestic borrowing activities also set a tone within the domestic financial system. So this is then going to go into how I did mention earlier that a majority of the bank's portfolio in the financial system is skewed towards public instruments. So if the banks are going to consider outside of these instruments, which are attracting very high interest rates, the question then is, what will they do for the private? Okay, so the private must offer more. All right, so generally for the business community, it's going to also influence borrowing costs. All right, and then the fourth point is equity deals. All right. When we look at equity transactions, we have implications on valuation. All right. And there are a number of things I can talk about, but to make it very simple for our audience and our listeners, I'll just summarize it in two areas. One, the reduced value of businesses, because if we look at the discounted cash flow metrics, for example, we are going to have a scenario where we are going to be discounting cash flows at higher cost factors. Okay, and so that would reduce value if you build in the high cost of interest rates. Then I also talk about cost of equity, which is a factor, in determining business value, and generally the expectation of equity holders. So that is also an area that is going to go high. So for equity transactions, in distress, where we have a sovereign distress scenario, values tend to go downward. And so these are some of the key areas within the financial system and core pillars within borrowing and doing capital raising transactions like equity that I believe the business community would have some form of direct interaction with as a result of the downgrade.
Well, so this is a very critical situation. Ghana and then so many other low-income countries are in this situation where these ratings affect the sovereign credit and also the corporate credits. So it has both a public and a private effect in an economy. But looking at all this, I mean, the question that comes is that what's the way out? How do we come out of this situation? We can describe the problem, but we need to find a solution. And looking at what is happening right now, IMF seems to be at the center of the stage. Is IMF Ghana's only way out?
Well, I would say yes and no. The yes is for the fact that if you look at the immediate short term, there's nothing we can do than have something going with IMF. Okay. There's absolutely nothing we can do at this particular point. I believe the policymakers weighed all the options, and the decision was to go to the IMF. Now, I like to say this came up as a result of failure of some homegrown policies. You can remember the failure of the e-levy to attract the needed revenue. So we are having fiscal challenges. Okay. And there isn't any immediate solution. And what is this whole fiscal challenge? We are having debt service very high, and then we have a high wage bill. We are not yet even talking about financing our infrastructure. We are talking about servicing debt, meeting our obligations, and paying our interest. And we are not generating sufficient revenue for this purpose. We keep borrowing to sustain the economy, but this is where we have cost of borrowing skyrocketing. So debt is not even growing at a normal level. Debt is really growing at very high levels. So in the immediate, we really need an IMF program to halt what is happening, to bring some ease. And then we look at the second part where I say no. No is because in the long term, we have to fix our issues as a country. So in the short term, yes to IMF, but in the long term, we do not have any other, in the long term, we need to find our own sustainable solutions to our issues. We need to look at fiscal challenges in terms of revenue, and then we need to look at the cost lines. There have been so many conversations around this, and particularly economic infrastructure to stir development in the economy. So this is what I have to say about the question if IMF is the only way out.
Okay. So the IMF situation, yes, it's a yes and no response, and we're looking forward to how things will turn out to be. But before we sign out, the monetary policy rate just came out. I just want to know your thoughts about the current release. Puts the MPR at a high rate. So what are your thoughts on it? It's 24.5% now, a 250 basis points increase.
Yes, I mean, it's nothing out of the blue, really, because all this increasing monetary or policy rates are all in a direction to handle inflation. Currently, we are dealing with the issues of food and energy, which is really a big factor in inflation, particularly what is happening. So one thing that is happening within the energy spaces, there's generally food inflation, which is as a result of a number of factors. But even what is making it worse is energy issues are even making food issues worse. As for the food issues, we have a number of reasons. There are layers. I mean, can take it all the way back to COVID-19 and all the issues that, of course, what it is, bring it to Russia, Ukraine, so on and so forth. But aside that, the issues we're having in energy prices is also increasing the already inflated food prices. So the monetary policy rate increment is once again an attempt by the central bank to influence money supply, money in circulation, the cost at which it moves around, in order to control inflation. So it's just an attempt to control inflation. The level of, or let me say how effective it will be is subject to, the kind of analysis the policy makers they to arrive at, how it should go. But I believe generally it's a mechanism and tool that is used by many central banks to curb inflation. So it's not surprising at all.
And clearly it's not surprising, as it has been the trend over almost all central banks. I mean, the Fed and other central banks all across the globe are tightening their monetary policies and all that. So listeners, this brings us to the end of today's episode on the credit ratings and implications on the financial service sectors and the business community at large. Thank you for joining us, Prosper, for today, and we hope to have you another time.
Thank you so much, Matthias.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, leave us a comment and subscribe to the Bridgewater Perspective. You can also send your questions to theperspective@bridgewatergh.com. The information contained in this podcast is of a general nature and is not intended to address the circumstances of any particular individual or entity. No one should act on such information without appropriate professional advice after a thorough examination of the particular situation. Bridgewater does not accept or assume any liability, responsibility, or duty of care for any consequences of you or anyone else acting or refraining to act in reliance on the information contained in this podcast or for any decision based on it.